Question 3. With reference to working paper 3, got to look for weaknesses in the temporary employment process, and for each weakness, describe an internal control. You have been given a format, so before you go into working paper 3, go and put your format down and get that 1 easy mark. Question 3, I would probably space it that, pretty much you can go even spacing, weakness, internal control. And I'm going to start with 1 and 1. I'm looking for the weaknesses in the process. I'm not looking for risks just from the information. So this first risk that I have, that temporary might not be removed, I would have to see that there is a missing control. And so I'd have to go and read the process in order to pick up that there is a weakness, because maybe they have got a control for that. And so that was an initial observation. I now go into the actual structure. So I've put down my process here and I've said there is that planning schedule, there is a contract, then there is the payroll, and then there's the EFT. It pretty much fits the payroll cycle in terms of documents for the employment of a salaried employee, which is the case because this person is going to work a contract term and get paid for that. It's not an hourly or daily rate. Okay, so it makes sense that there would be this request for an employee. A contract has to be then signed and agreed upon. Payroll will then be run and then payment will take place. So in terms of the documents and the process, that kind of makes sense. I've now got to go and then see where my weaknesses really lie. So as we work through, there's a concern that all the 4 HR personnel source the same job title. So there's no segregation of duties in terms of who is going to be doing what with regards to that project schedule. So I'm going to say there's a lack of segregation of duties in that all 4 HR personnel could staff the same job title. And so my control, there needs to be segregation of duties, so they need to split up the responsibilities for sourcing the job titles. So ultimately, they've got to get 5 jobs. So each of them will take 1 job, one will have 2. Right, so they know exactly what their responsibility is to not duplicate a job title. Okay, next we've got here that the candidate doesn't have the necessary skills because there's no criteria other than a job title. So if you think back to your revenue cycle, for your debtors, a control before they gave a debtor a credit was to set a credit limit, do a credit check. So same thing now needs to happen here with regards to this employee. There needs to be a criteria that will determine whether they have the necessary skills for that job title, and maybe references need to be obtained. So I'm going to say my weakness is that there is a lack of criteria for a contractor, and therefore they could get unskilled persons. So what do they need to do? They need to set a criteria for each job title which needs to include qualifications and references to ensure that they have got the necessary skills for this job. And then we've said that there's no authorized or approved contractors list. They should have a list of contractors for each of these different job titles, because this is something that they do regularly. There's no approved contractor list. And I can say there should be an approved contractor list, because they regularly require these roles. My next two weaknesses are both with regards to the source document. The contracts are blank, which means they get to fill them in, and they can fill them in completely incorrectly. And secondly, they're not pre-numbered. So I'm going to add those two. They've got weak source document controls, and I'll say that they send contracts blank, and they're not sequentially numbered. And so how can they improve this? They need to complete all the necessary fields and only leave the contractor to sign, and they should be sequentially numbered. Okay, I've then put some application controls down for these electronic fields. They haven't mentioned anything about them, so I'm going to say that those are potentially weaknesses. So I'm going to say they don't appear to have the necessary input application controls, and I'm going to give the examples. Weak input controls over the electronic contracts. For example, no alphanumerical for the name, for ID number, for the amount, no size check for the ID number, no sign check for the fee. Can also add here the bank account number. No range check for the date or contract period. No range check. So just a few of the application controls that I know should be there. And so, how do we address it? The following. Application controls are required. Alphanumerical. You'll obviously write that out for the examples. Size for the ID. Sign for the fee, range for the contract period. I could also say there's no access controls to ensure that this person is the only person who can access that document. So again, there could be access controls, username, and password to ensure it's the valid employee who's going to be completing that contract. Okay, and that's all of my controls that are listed here. Then I've got here that they're required to tick mandatory field. That already tells me that they have got a mandatory field, so I can leave that out. I've got no authorization of the employee. No authorization by senior HR manager of the employee. Senior manager should review and authorize the contract. And I'm going to cross that off and the signing of the contract together. Then I've got no access controls because the contracts are saved on an open network. So I need to have contracts need to be saved in a restricted area where only the relevant people allowed to access have authority through username and password. I've also got here no isolation of responsibility. Who was responsible for setting up that contract, ultimately authorizing it? I've already addressed the authorization of it, so I think we can leave this for now. Okay, because if the HR manager does sign it, he would ultimately be responsible for that contract. Okay, then I've got no recon of the employment contract to the production schedule. And guys, that could also have been put up here when we were saying in terms of authorization of it. Person who authorized should actually be reconciling to the project schedule to make sure that it is a valid employee. Okay, but we'll put it down here for NAS, but it's applicable for both. So no reconciliation of employment contracts to the project schedule, and this could be both by your HR manager and also your payroll administrator. And therefore there needs to be reconciliation of employment contracts to the project schedule by both HR manager and payroll administrator. Got that now. My next one is no access controls, open network for the payroll app. Payroll app on a open network. So there should be restricted access to the payroll. Only valid employees, authorized employees with a valid username and password should have access. So I'll go and fix that, authorized.